Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue right along with our discussion on the Kennedy administration as John Kennedy attempted to make his stamp on the Cold War and to sort of shore up and reinvigorate the United States foreign policy and the United States' stance towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. Um, in our last lecture, we discussed the peculiar set of circumstances that brought Kennedy to the presidency, namely the tragic death of his elder brother Joe Jr. during World War II. His father's ambitions, unbridled ambition for the family, and the family's legacy. The fact that his father once described in a very telling remark his ideas, his belief on getting John Kennedy the right exposure with and that of course that remark, that comment being, we're going to sell him like soap flakes. Um, we also discussed the Cuban Revolution, which occurred at around the same time that Kennedy was campaigning against Nixon for the presidency in 1960. The revolution happened in 1959. But that revolution brought in a change of government in Cuba, a very radical change of government. The United States-backed Batista regime was replaced by the Castro regime of Fidel Castro, and Fidel Castro very quickly came into an association with the communist leaders in the Soviet Union. And based off of that alliance, it sparked a huge international crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which will be the first topic that we discuss today. Um, Now, after Castro accepted the benefits of the alliance with the Soviet Union, the downside quickly reared its head. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, wanted to establish a series of Soviet missile bases on Cuba in response to the United States' placement of missiles in Greece and Turkey. Khrushchev sent ships bearing missiles to Cuba in October of 1962. Now, Kennedy sent out the United States Navy and drew a quarantine line around the island of Cuba, with the intention being to prevent at all costs the Soviets' armada from making landfall on Cuba. Now, this was the scariest moment of the entire Cold War. This was the moment where the world really came close to an all-out nuclear war. Nuclear World War III was really about to happen. World War III was about to happen, and it was about to be a nuclear war. This was that moment. Everyone held their breath. Cooler heads prevailed. Um, uh, with the prospect of nuclear war looming down the barrel, looming back at him, Khrushchev backed down, and he resumed diplomatic talks. Calmer relations prevailed, and the United States agreed to remove the missiles it had stationed in Turkey and Greece. The improved relations led to the groundbreaking atmospheric testing ban treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union sometime later. Now, on the domestic front, those have been the prime two foreign policy events, or foreign policy main draws during the Kennedy years. On the domestic front, the Kennedy administration took limited initiatives on behalf of ethnic minorities, women, and of course the poor. Kennedy was lukewarm at best on divisive issues. And this was based in some part, some real part, on the narrowness of its 1960 victory and the power of the Dixiecrats in Congress. Kennedy was very anxious to not alienate. Sorry about that. It's been a very long morning here. Kennedy was very anxious to not alienate his support base in Congress. Um, he was already looking ahead to the 1964 election and its re-election bid. He did not want to seem as too accommodating on civil rights matters. Now, Kennedy commissioned a committee on the status of women. He raised the pursued policy, domestic policy that would raise the minimum wage, and began the process of creating low-cost, low-income housing. Now, over the course of the years of the Kennedy years, he became more and more sympathetic to the civil rights movement. Had the violence of the segregationists continued and grew more severe. And his brother, the then sitting Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was more enthusiastic about civil rights. When James Meredith attempted to enroll at the University of Mississippi, Robert Kennedy sent out federal marshals to the campus to ensure that no calamity befell Meredith. Now, the marshals were attacked by segregationists when they arrived there to offer some measure of protection to Meredith. Robert Kennedy, in response, sent in federal troops to back up, to shore up the marshals that he had sent there. Now, Kennedy's presidency, for all the positives or the negatives that people have on it, and the presidency is one that's contentious. It's always drawn scholarship, but not really heavy analysis of its accomplishments or his failures. For all opinions that may be held on it, it came to a screeching halt in November of 1963 with the assassination of President Kennedy, as he rode in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. Now, Kennedy's death gave breath to a great American urban legend. And this urban legend regards presidents elected in even years ending in zero. Beginning with Thomas Jefferson, who did not die in office, but whose presidency was marked by the decisive, by the rather rash and I should say impulsive decision to scuttle the Federalist fleet and champion the Embargo Act, died a broken and bankrupt man. He was hounded during his presidency with allegations made notably by James Callender of his inappropriateness of his relations with Sally Hemings. And as a matter of fact, Callender actually died in a murder mystery that's still kind of that has never been solved, nor will it probably ever be solved. But Callender died in, I think, less than 2 or 3 feet of water, drowned in less than 2 or 3 feet of water. And it was heavily implied that Jefferson or men sympathetic to Jefferson had a hand in Callender's demise. Now, John Quincy Adams, who came to the presidency. Well, no, not John Quincy Adams. William Henry Harrison caught a cold. He was elected in 1840. He was the first president to die in office. William Henry Harrison, he caught a cold and he died after his inauguration. Abraham Lincoln, 1860, 20 years later, was assassinated shortly after the Civil War ended. James A. Garfield, 1880, he was assassinated. He was shot. McKinley won the election of 1900, and he was assassinated shortly thereafter. Warren Harding won the election of 1920, and he died in office. And Harding had a scandal-ridden presidency himself, but he died in office. Franklin Roosevelt won 20 years later, he won the election of 1940, and he died in office shortly after the election of 1944. A lot of mystery surrounds the Kennedy assassination. Did Oswald act alone? Was there another man on the grassy knoll? Does the Zapruder film of the actual event contain proof of multiple assassins? We'll really never know. After Kennedy's death, Earl Warren led a commission to investigate the matter. And of course, Earl Warren was then the sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Rather than resolving the issue, it really intensified the mystery. The mystery was also intensified because a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby shot Oswald before he could tell the full story. Oswald's murder deepen the uncertainty. Was he connected to the Soviet Union, the mafia, the Cubans, the segregationists? The Kennedy assassination continued to inspire theories. And for further footnote, after Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, who won the election in 1980, he was shot. Um, he was shot by a man obsessed with Jodie Foster, the actress. He wanted to catch Jodie Foster's attention. John Hinckley was the man who shot Reagan. He wanted to capture Jodie Foster's attention, and he thought shooting the president would be just a way to do so. Not Lincoln. Reagan. Reagan was shot. Reagan survived, and most people thought that the curse was broken or that it simply faded away. A lot of Reaganites, Ronald Reagan supporters, tend to hold that view. George Bush Jr., who won the election of 2000, he had a shoe thrown at him, and he had another assassination attempt. He had a shoe thrown at him when he was in Iraq, and he had there was an assassination attempt while he was visiting the Republic of Georgia. He survived both attempts, and he's still alive today. He finished the presidency. Now, Kennedy's good looks and the mystique that he and his family cultivated and turning the White House into something reminiscent of the fabled Camelot, the mythical castle of the mythical King Arthur, coupled with the sudden and untimely death that he had and the tragic death that he suffered, really turned him into a larger-than-life figure. During the Kennedy years, a number of poets and classical musicians were brought to the White House to perform. It was said that the best and the brightest men in America were members of Kennedy's cabinet. Kennedy himself was a master at using very lofty rhetoric that encapsulated that sort of encapsulated this mystique, and he himself really outdid himself with his inaugural address. Very famous quote that Kennedy made, that is attributed to Kennedy, is, of course, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. His actual record of president is far from stellar, and it is easy to label his foreign policy as simply being reckless. It's easy to distract from his legacy because of his escalation of the war in Vietnam, something that we again will be getting to at in a later lecture. It's easy to see that he sort of instigated the building of the Berlin Wall, and really to bring the war to and bring the world to the brink of war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there's a lot to be said about the use of soft words to calm a situation. And after the experiences of the 1950s with conformity, the rise of civil rights, the mid-20th century civil rights movement, the burgeoning women's rights movement, which we will get to in a later date, and of course the hysteria over McCarthyism and the second Great Red Scare. Kennedy's sort of easygoing, lofty rhetoric and this sort of image that he and his family sort of perpetuated, really did a lot domestically for the Republic to sort of create this sort of easy and relaxed environment. Now, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was Kennedy's vice president, and he was sworn into office as Kennedy's successor on the plane ride back from Dallas to Washington. Now, the Johnson administration continued and escalated the work that had been done under the Kennedy administration. Johnson had a very different background than Kennedy. Johnson rose from humble origins in Texas. His grandfather had been a populist in the 1890s, and he was already a seasoned veteran in Washington politics by the time Kennedy arrived in 1946. In the 1930s, he had been a congressional aide. He was present at the creation of the New Deal programs. He has served as the supervisor of the National Youth Administration in Texas. He served in Congress before the eruption of World War II. He unsuccessfully ran for a Senate seat. After the failure of that campaign, he went into the Navy. In 1946, he ran for a Senate seat. This time, his campaign was founded. Sorry about that. Ooh, in 1946, he ran again for a Senate seat. This time, his campaign was besieged, were confounded by with allegations that that he had engaged in widespread fraud. Nevertheless, Johnson was a very capable politician and a very capable party manager. He was reelected in 1954 and served as the Senate Majority Leader. By 1960, he had nearly 30 years of experience with Washington politics and a well-deserved reputation for political savvy. During the Democratic Party caucus leading up to the 1960 election, Lyndon Johnson had been a leading contender before being beaten out by John Kennedy. Now, after Kennedy beat out Johnson, he asked him to come aboard his campaign to serve as his running mate. Now, Kennedy did so to shore up his support amongst Dixiecrats. He did this to gain their support. Johnson and Kennedy did not get along very well. It's really been noted that Johnson was not an insider or confidant of Kennedy. He was very much on the outside of the administration. Johnson felt overshadowed by the mystique of the Kennedys. As he came to power, as he assumed the presidency in the aftermath of the assassination, he was scorned by the Kennedy loyalists, that is, the men in the cabinet when he took over. Men who had grown used and accustomed over the years of simply ridiculing him, of making open jokes about him, and literally just demeaning him. They was in a very powerless position. It's been said that the office of vice president is really just an honorific. You know, you're on standby for the president, but you're not really involved. The presidency of Barack Obama is a bit different. Barack Obama and Joe Biden really seem to develop a friendship, which stands in marked contrast to, let's say, previous eras. It can certainly be said that Nixon used Spiro Agnew very well. You know, he used Agnew to really drive home and to really sort of stomp for him. Same, I guess, can be said of Cheney and Bush Jr. Cheney, it was said, you know, held a lot of held a lot of the cards in the Bush administration, the Bush Jr. administration. But certainly, Nixon wasn't in Eisenhower's inner circle. Certainly none of Franklin Roosevelt's vice presidents, certainly not Harry Truman. They were not in Roosevelt's inner circle. It wasn't, the office was mainly just an honorific. It wasn't, oh, you're my good friend, we're gonna do this together. It wasn't that. And Johnson was shunned by the people who were. Johnson found that though he was now president, he would have to woo the Kennedy loyalists in the cabinet that he had inherited to help him with his agenda. Johnson, unlike Kennedy, was very engrossed in legislative details of his Congresses. He was known to call recalcitrant members of the House and the Senate into the White House, into his personal quarters, and give them what was called the treatment. That is, telling them anecdotes, browbeating them, and when necessary, cajoling them to persuade them to support his legislation. Interesting stories about President Johnson abound even to this day. There are a number of stories of him calling in members of Congress or members of his cabinet while he was on the lavatory, and to have them just stand there in the doorway and listen to him talk to them while he used the facilities, or to hand him a roll of toilet paper. A lot of little anecdotes like that of Johnson's personal touches, his personal managerial styles, his personal oversight style. Now with that, Johnson comes off a lot better His legislative accomplishments certainly come off a whole lot better than anything that Kennedy accomplished or Kennedy attempted to accomplish. Um, in comparison, the Congresses under Lyndon Johnson passed almost as much legislation as did Roosevelt's administration during the first 100 days, um, which is quite a remarkable achievement, quite a remarkable feat. Um, Under Johnson's management, uh, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Immigration Reform Act. Johnson won re-election handsomely in 1964 against Barry Goldwater. Now, Goldwater was a conservative Republican from the state of Arizona, and Goldwater's campaign focused on rolling back the New Deal. By this time, the New Deal was still rather new. It had only been around for about 30 years, just about a generation and a half. Um, Goldwater wanted to abolish the income tax, which again had only been around for about two generations. Um, and he also wanted to get rid of Social Security. He wanted to sell off the Tennessee Valley Authority. He wanted to literally undo everything that had been accomplished over the last 30 years. Now, Goldwater's followers promoted him with the slogan, "In your hearts, you know he's right," to which his detractors said, were very humorously known to respond, "Yes, but in your guts, you know he's nuts." So a lot of rip-roaring rhymes between the two camps there. Now Goldwater was incredibly tactless in his campaign. Um, Goldwater is noted for going before crowds and speaking against their interests. He did so to the employees of the Tennessee Valley Authority. He did so in Florida to retirees. And he did so in Florida, and the retirees, he told them his plans for abolishing Social Security. And these were people who were no longer able to work, who were no longer able to compete against the younger generation of workers. He told them that he was going to take away Social Security and make life infinitely harder for them. And Goldwater really couldn't relate because Goldwater was a millionaire. He was an heir to a shopping franchise, a store, a goods shopping goods franchise here in Arizona. Um, During the campaign, Goldwater alleged that Johnson was irresolute in addressing communism, which encouraged Johnson to prosecute the Vietnam War more vigorously after his reelection. Now, the War on Poverty programs, which Johnson championed, called for an all-out assault on poverty to eradicate it root and stem from the Republic. Johnson's hope was that a host of federal programs would be able to self-start a generation of Americans, much as the congressional aid packages had been able to do so from the very beginning. Looking at the Land Deal Acts, in the settling of the what is now the Great Lakes states, or the Homestead Acts that allow for people to simply claim land in the Western territories. Johnson wanted to sort of bring those types of legislation to aid poor Americans who were either deliberately left out via racial hygienic laws in the territories, barring the movements of peoples, or those who had come into to work in urban manufacturing centers and simply been trapped in this cycle of low wages. Johnson wanted to create a body of legislation to overcome that. Johnson also had in mind, and this is more recent, the host of legislation that was passed after World War II to ensure that the veterans coming back from World War II were able to purchase housing, were able to get affordable auto loans, were able to go to school, to get an education. And in particular, we're looking at the VA housing loan and VA education loan. Johnson wanted to create legislation on par with that, seeing how wonderfully they had worked out for veterans, European American veterans coming back from the wars overseas in Europe and in Asia and in the Pacific. Now, Johnson also oversaw the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, which were created as health insurance policies for the elderly and the indigent. Again, picking up on this, these are all a part of his Great Society program. Picking up on all of these, Johnson wanted to pick up the best ideas of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal with the strategies that had worked after World War One. After World War II, sorry, to sort of sustain the boom that had been going on in the United States from the 1950s through the 1960s, through the early 1960s. Now, these policies hinted at a great reformed future for the Republic, but no sooner as they were established did the race riots of the 60s broke out. Those riots of the long, hot, sweltering summers. First in Watts, then spreading through the Republic in the ensuing years. It seemed that though after 1965, every year there were multiple riots in multiple cities. The riots led to a series of questions regarding proposals of Johnson's domestic plan. Many began to question whether or not they were very lofty and very high aiming, but many began to question whether those were the programs needed, or whether those programs alone could rectify the growing wealth disparity in the United States. Many commented that the programs themselves seemed utopian, and that they did not take into consideration the actual situations that made the riots break out in the first place. And that would be a hint at the Kerner report that was released after the Great Detroit Riot of 1967. To complicate matters more and more, the resources that would have been available to really get the Great Society off of the ground was being diverted in larger and larger amounts to aid in the prosecution of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, and more importantly, the diverting of these crucial funds and personnel from invigorating the Great Society with these flush of resources was a real sticking sore point, a real sticking area for the break between Johnson and some of his more liberal allies, some of his allies who he certainly thought would have backed him up in a prosecution of the Vietnam War, and also back him up just whenever his name or his legacy would be assaulted or assailed. Now, the tragedy with all of this was that Johnson's was sort of in political shambles by the end of his second term in 1968-69, and that the funding that would have been needed for these social programs were slashed or abandoned. Those were the real tragedies of the split between Johnson and his allies. Now, the pattern of difficulties really had a lot to do with the bringing down of the Johnson administration, and we'll get to that in our next lecture. For now, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I am Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.